The coming glory. The ashes of the old have to die out before the new can come in. Those were the words of the late Kirsty Maggie of Arnol village. She had been a 16-year-old girl in the revival in 1949. I came to the island of Lewis in 1998, and I was staying in Arnol village with the MacTaggarts. I think I'd been about 2 or 3 weeks in that house when I went to the bedroom where I was staying for a little time, a wee time of prayer. And I sat on the edge of the bed, and as I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly I was no longer in that room. I found myself in a house in the village of Arnol, a house which I had never been in before. And in that house there was an old man and his daughter. And my attention was drawn to the fireplace, because there, in the grate of the fire, there was no peat, not even any ash. And I knew that in winter time, people like to keep the fires going all the time, burning the peat. But here was this completely empty fireplace. And I saw my mother and father. And my mother was rubbing her hands saying, "It's very cold in here." And then suddenly, I was back in the bedroom. It was almost like I had a dream, sat on the bed. I hadn't fallen asleep, I was still sat on the bed. Well, I realise now, as somebody else also mentioned to me, you were in a trance. So I mentioned this to Mrs. MacTaggart, and she has a daughter that lives in the village. And she mentioned this kind of vision I'd had to the daughter. And she said, that was really interesting. She said, because Kirsty Maggie told me something only this week. And apparently, Kirsty Maggie had been going to light the fire, or keep the fire going, the peat fire. And she was thinking about all these people, Americans and different tourists, that come to the island of Lewis to find out about the revival that took place in 1949. And she kind of was praying and speaking to the Lord, and she said, "Well, Lord, that revival has come and gone. We need another one." And then, apparently, she distinctly heard the Lord say to her, "The ashes of the old have to die out before the new can come in." So, Mrs. MacTaggart's daughter told her this, and then Mrs. MacTaggart came to me and she told me what her daughter had said. So I thought, well, it'd be good for me if I could go to see Kirsty Maggie in the village. So a day or two later, on the off chance that she was in, I went to the house and tapped the door, and she came to the door and invited me in, and I began to speak to her about this visionary experience. And she looked at me and she told me exactly the same thing that she told Anna in the village. And this was amazing, because not only did she tell me that, but she told me that the house that I'd seen in that vision was the very house that Duncan Campbell preached in when she was a teenage girl. And I knew nothing about that house, what went off in that house, nothing about that history. And she said when Duncan Campbell was preaching in that house, she said she ran out of that house. But the presence of God followed her right back to her home. And we were sat in the kitchen, and she said it was in this kitchen, she said, as I came in, she says, I felt something. And she says, he walked in. And she said she could hear the rustling of the Lord's garments. And she was wonderfully born again. But one of the things she told me about that house was that in that house there lives an old man with his daughter. And I'd never met them. I'd only been in Arnol for about 2 weeks. So everything was there in that house with the people exactly as I'd seen it in the vision. Except my mother and father had never visited the Isle of Lewis. Now they did a number of years later. And I took that to mean that we're getting nearer to what was spoken to Kirsty Maggie. Now you see, this is very important, because there are many people come to the island and they believe by going to the very places where God's Spirit poured out that they can redig the wells. But according to the word that was given to Kirsty Maggie, and she was in that revival, according to the word that was given to her a number of years ago when she was nearly in her 80s, according to that word, the ashes of the old have to die out. They have to be completely dead. So you cannot restart a revival from that past revival. It is something brand new coming in. In other words, the ashes have to die out, then they have to be cleared out of the grate, and brand new wood, fuel, paper, everything to light a fire has to be put onto that grate. And this is very important. Now, that dear woman, Kirsty Maggie, went to be with the Lord. A few years ago she was in her 80s. And now she's in the presence of God, far more glorious than any revival on this earth. But I would say to you, there is a timing on everything, and we cannot speed it up. But perhaps we can be prepared, like we can put that wood or the paper, and then the splinters, and then the wood, and then the peat, waiting for God to come and light that fire. So there has to be nothing remaining of that old revival. And there are still 1 or 2 people alive who are in that revival. And so I'm not wishing them home to glory so the revival can start. That wouldn't be right. But there is a timing on it. And we cannot speed it up. We cannot come in and blow shofars and say, we're rekindling the wells, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing the other. No. We cannot resurrect that revival. It's gone. But God is going to send something else. Because he said to that dear woman, and she knew the Lord, she walked with the Lord. She was saved when she was 16, under Duncan Campbell and the Holy Ghost coming powerfully, as I just shared with you. So she walked with the Lord. And she heard him distinctly. The ashes of the old have to die out before the new can come in.